Hello and welcome to our course on Adobe Photoshop Elements 13, the latest version of Adobe's award-winning Photoshop Elements product. My name is Toby and I'm your instructor on this course. Now before we actually begin, I've got a few things to tell you about in this section, and the first of them is to tell you that this is a course for beginners. If you are an experienced Photoshop Elements user, then this course is really set at probably too basic a level for you. However, if you have a very old copy of Photoshop Elements that you've been using, it may well be that so many things have changed that covering this course right through is really a good idea for you. And also, if you're upgrading even from a relatively recent version, each version of Photoshop Elements does introduce new features, and it may be that even if you don't need to watch the whole course, there are substantial parts of it that are a good idea for you to follow. Now in this section I'm going to cover a background to Photoshop Elements, basically what it is, how it's different from Photoshop itself, some information about acquiring Photoshop Elements, and some details about the content of the course. So if you're new to Photoshop Elements or you really want a pretty thorough grounding in it, you need to watch all of this first section, and even if there may be one or two sections later on that you may not be interested in, and I'll come back to that in a moment as well, I still think it's a good idea for you to look at the first 2 or 3 sections because they really do have some important information in them. So let me talk briefly about Photoshop first. Photoshop is arguably the most popular and probably most significant photo editing, graphics editing, etc. package in use, particularly in business and business related to design, images, photography and so on in the world. And Photoshop Elements is really a consumer version, a cut down version of Photoshop. When I say it's a cut down version, I think it's fair to say that the version is not very cut down. There is a surprisingly large amount of Photoshop in Photoshop Elements. However, 1 or 2 of the things that are left out are absolutely critical if you are a professional user of Photoshop. And in particular, one of the things that's left out is the use of what's called the CMYK color system. And if you wanted to use Photoshop in a commercial environment, perhaps prepare items for commercial printing, you really couldn't do it without CMYK. And given that that isn't part of Photoshop Elements, you'd need to use Photoshop itself. Now there is, however, a very good consequence of this close relationship between the two, and that is that if you learn how to use Photoshop Elements, you really will know a lot about how to use Photoshop. And if you subsequently decide to move up to Photoshop, you're going to find you've got a good head start if you know how to use Photoshop Elements already. One of the things I'll be doing from time to time on the course is using some of the online material from Adobe themselves. So here I started off at the Adobe Photoshop Elements 13 overview page. I've now clicked on the Features tab, and if you look down the Features tab, one of the sections, the first section, is See What's New. So if you're an experienced Photoshop Elements user, you may want to start there. It'll give you some idea of the new things that you can do with PSE 13. Further down the page you can see some of the more conventional things that you can do with PSE. Generally speaking, you can divide the functions of PSE into 4 main groups. The first group are the functions that enable you to capture images, normally from a camera but could be say from a scanner, or to create images. You can start with, if you like, a blank electronic sheet of paper and you can actually paint an image yourself in PSE. You don't need to use a camera at all, you can actually paint with it. You can do drawings, you can use quite sophisticated graphic tools. The second area of functionality is the organization of images. And this is where one of the main elements of PSE, what's called the organizer, comes into force. Now I need to say right up front that I know many people that use recent versions of PSC that never use the organizer. They only use the editing side of PSC. Now I'll try to explain to you a little bit why that is later on, but in fact the organizer is one part of PSC that I'm going to cover in some detail early on, because it's, I think, a pretty good way of organizing your captured or created images in such a way that it's relatively easy to find images later on. I know people that don't use the organizer at all, but I know other people that have the organizer with tens of thousands of images in it, and they can find an image of a particular subject that they took on a holiday 5, 10, 15 years ago in a matter of seconds, which for many people is a very important thing to be able to do. The third area of functionality is the area of editing images, and this can be anything from correcting flaws in images to substantially changing photographic images, what some people think of as cheating, but also to enhancing images, adding effects to images, perhaps turning a photo into black and white, adding blur or sharpening an image. Many features of PSC are about changing images, hopefully for the better. And then the fourth area is the area of presentation, making photo books, making slideshows, and particularly nowadays sharing your images on social media, particularly, for example, Facebook. The next thing I want to talk about is how to acquire a copy of PSC 13, and in doing that it'll bring up another very important point about the course. If you click on the Buying Guide tab on the page that I started with, you'll see the price from Adobe of Photoshop Elements 13, and in most locations there is a sort of bundle price for Photoshop Elements and Premiere Elements. Premiere Elements is the video editing brother or sister product for Photoshop Elements. Now I don't cover Premiere Elements on this course. I will mention it once or twice in relation to specific things, but this is a course about Photoshop Elements, not Premiere Elements. Now assuming that you don't already have a copy of Photoshop Elements 13, you can of course buy it. You can buy it at your local computer store, possibly at your local photography store. You can certainly buy it online, and you can certainly buy it from Adobe. If I click on the Buy Now button, it takes me through to the UK store where I could buy PSC 13 or that bundle. It gives me a breakdown of price. It gives me the option of whether I want to buy the full version or an upgrade. It's not necessarily the case that you can buy an upgrade in your local store. You may only be able to get an upgrade from Adobe, but this will depend on your locale. I'll come back to that in a moment. You can buy the Windows version or the Mac version, and generally speaking nowadays PSC 13 is provided as a download. In your locale I don't know whether it's possible for you to get a DVD based product in a box. Even if you buy the product at a local store in the UK, you basically get a token, a card from which you get a license key, but then you still download the product anyway. Clearly, if you have a reasonable internet connection, download's a good option. If you don't, then you need to take that up with Adobe, I'm afraid. Now one thing here is of course that I've so far been looking at the UK Adobe site, and you're looking at UK pricing. A lot of the time on this course I'm going to be using the US locale, but your locale will be important for a number of reasons. Not only of course because of pricing, which we won't be talking about much beyond this point, but also in terms of the units that you use, whether you use metric units, imperial units, a mixture of the two, and that's something I'm going to come back to later on in the course. So if you don't already have Photoshop Elements 13 installed, you'd like to find out what it can do and how to use it, one good option is to download the free trial that is generally available from Adobe. Now I have to say at this point that if Adobe withdraw the free trial, it's not really my fault, or at least I hope it isn't. But in all the time that I've been using Photoshop Elements, and that's a long time, there has always been a free trial of the latest version. It's available in a limited number of languages. That's the list for the free trial of PSE 13 when I'm recording this. But you can download the free trial. It generally lasts for 30 days, so you could probably get through the whole of this course in 30 days if you've got enough time. And it's a really good way of finding out what you can do with PSE 13. Now, if you don't already have PSE 13 installed and you're thinking of buying it or getting a trial version, a word of warning: make sure that you can meet the tech specs that are available on the Adobe site. You have system requirements for Windows and for Mac and a list of the available language versions. Note that in the case of Windows, for example, you need a 1.6 gigahertz or faster processor, Windows 7 or Windows 8. I'm running it on a Windows PC. It's running Windows 8.1. I'm using 8 gigabytes of RAM, and I'm using a touch device which also supports gestures in front of the screen as well. Now, I really won't be using touch very much on this course. I will mention it once or twice, and there is a certain amount of touch support in PSE, but as far as I'm concerned, basically on this course I'm using mouse and keyboard. Which brings us to the subject of the Mac. Up until a couple of versions ago, there were quite a few differences between the PC and Mac versions, but most of these differences have now gone. There are still some differences related to device features, to services available for PCs and Macs and so on, but in terms of the functionality, there are very, very few differences. There are the standard differences, of course, in terms of menus and keyboard shortcuts and so on. But for Mac users who are used to following PC instructions and adapting them for the Mac, I'm sure you're going to have absolutely no trouble at all following this course, because the course is really about the functionality of PSE rather than anything too specific to do with a PC or a Mac. So once again, if you don't already have PSE 13 installed, but you've now bought a copy, downloaded a copy, perhaps downloaded the trial version, you're going to need to install it. If you search for Install Photoshop Elements on the Adobe site, you will find whatever the equivalent of this page is. This is the PSE 13 installation instructions. It's all pretty clear. I'm not going to cover installation. If something goes wrong, there are various troubleshooting, FAQ pages and so on to cover what goes wrong. In my experience, PSE 13 installs pretty cleanly, but it's pretty certain that whenever there's a new version of a product like PSE coming out, somebody has a problem installing it. It may be their fault, it may not be their fault, but hopefully your installation will go smoothly and you'll finish up with an installed copy of PSE 13 on your PC or on your Mac. And in fact, that installed copy is going to be the starting point for the next section, because the first thing we're going to do in the next section is to start PSE up and then get used to the PSE workspace. So that just leads me to tell you a little bit about the structure of the course. The course is arranged into sections or units which can be grouped into chapters. And apart from the quiz at the end of the course, during the course I'll be sending you a number of exercises. I'll provide you with an image that you can download, and then I'll give you a particular job to do on their image. Perhaps improve it or add something to it, or maybe mix it with another image. So there'll be quite a bit of practical work to do. The most important thing really before you start the course, though, is to try to get as many of your own images together as you can, and preferably some that have problems. And then during the course, hopefully by following the course, you'll be able to fix some of those problems and maybe improve some of those images in all sorts of ways that you didn't imagine you'd be able to before. We're about ready to start, so in the next section we'll fire up PSE 13 and start finding out how to use it. Please join me for that.